What do you think the important kind of next significant shifts we need to see in the world of Bitcoin? Is it infrastructure? Is it to do with user experience? What are the things are you thinking about over the next kind of 4 years?
Yeah, I think it is actually the same thing that we're
Okay.
doing right now. Um, and that is one of the things when we talk about, or when I talk about the fact of Bitcoin's inevitable global adoption by everybody on the world, and that actually is inevitable, is that Bitcoin from a network perspective functionally doesn't have to change.
Yeah. It
Um,
actually works now.
yeah, it works now, and there are, realistically, in order to be able to facilitate all the world's transactions, there do have to be advancements to the Bitcoin network, but the core function, the core value proposition, the settling for final settlement, a currency transaction, the Bitcoin blockchain, now versus 5 years from now or 10 years from now will be functionally the same, technically and functionally the same. And whether payment channels are opened via the Lightning Network or other implementations that sit on top, again, there will be a Bitcoin transaction, and there are certain consensus rules that determine what is and isn't a Bitcoin. Those are not going to change. So I think about everything, all infrastructure that's being developed on Bitcoin is just figuring out how to leverage this rock that is a foundation. That is, there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. And if you want to transfer that, there are certain rules. They are consensus rules. They cannot be changed. They can't be changed because of the fact that not because there's a benevolent dictator, but that the network is decentralized and it's becoming more and more decentralized as it becomes larger. How do we better utilize this resource that exists today? Those three things: focusing on more and more secure custody, companies like ourselves and
Mm.
Casa and Spectre and Sparrow and River and Swan, or anybody contributing to Bitcoin custody, um, developing more and more secure solutions. That ease of use is part of it. It's delivering secure solutions to secure custody solutions in a way that isn't necessarily trading off the ease of use versus the security. That doesn't mean everybody has to hold their own private keys, but it does mean that people have to reliably have to be able to hold Bitcoin without losing it, right? When if I talk about Bitcoin being a store of value and all of its value deriving from the fact that there will only be 21 million, and that Bitcoin has fundamental value to the world because it is finitely scarce and has a foundation for the world's new money, that scarcity is not of value to you if you do not understand it, or if it was possible for you to lose. Imagine you had one Bitcoin and 2 years from now you lost it and Bitcoin quintupled in purchasing power. Did it store value for you? No. So the continued advancement and development of custody, also the continued advancement of knowledge distribution, more podcasts, more books, better books, more meetups. That same thing that is happening today, that again, if Bitcoin is a fundamental value for that finite scarcity, that 21 million fixed supply, if you do not understand it and you buy it and it whipsaws around and you sell it and then it quintuples in value, did Bitcoin store value for you? No. Bitcoin might have increased in purchasing power, but did you benefit from it? So the focus on custody, the focus on knowledge distribution, because that is the only way that the world will inevitably adopt Bitcoin, but it's happening every day. I like to think about it as like each day somebody does read that book, they do learn that podcast, something happens in the world, people are censored in Canada, people are, Russia's cut off from the rest of the world. The Fed prints $3 trillion. There are real world experiences that help people understand Bitcoin, in addition to just reading books and listening to podcasts. And then the third thing being payments infrastructure. Those are the three core elements. There are other things that exist, but those are functionally all derivatives of what is the fundamental value proposition of Bitcoin as a form of money, storing value over time, and ultimately intermediating a series of transactions. I buy Bitcoin today. I'm going to hold it for a period of time. That might be an hour, a day, 5 years. At some point in time, I'm going to transact with that Bitcoin in the future, whether I'm converting back into dollars or I'm buying steaks from Cole Bolton 2 miles away in East Austin. And what is that about? It's about custody, and facilitating transactions and being able to facilitate payments. So I really think it's those three things: content, which is the education and the knowledge base, making sure that people can custody Bitcoin, again, whether they're holding their own keys or not, in a way that ensures that they do not lose it, and being able to provide direct access to transactions. That those three things, if those three things can continue to be developed, everything else is a derivative. And so we're working on it today, but it will attract more capital. As we attract more capital, the acceleration of the development of all three of those things will happen as a direct result.
Is there anyone who's got any more conviction than Parker Lewis in terms of the inevitability of Bitcoin every single time?
But you literally explained my journey with that like proof of work thing. Like I got in 2016, did all the shitcoin, all that kind of stuff. And in 2018, I remember sitting there being like, I was so excited about this for the last 18 months or whatever. Like I need to either give up or figure it out. And then through that period, you do the work, you learn it, and that's what completely changes you. And it does. I think it does. It's changed my relationship with money entirely.
I'll tell you another well, yes, and we've had all those conversations, like discussing mortgages and what's the best way to structure a mortgage based on the fact you want to hold as much Bitcoin as possible. Do you use the mortgage as a way to leverage money? Lots of things we've talked about that. But
or like Starbucks coffee costs $6, and that's some thousands amount of sats. Do I buy that, or do I stack sats instead? Right? When you when you start to understand Bitcoin, and even if its price has declined over the last 6 months or 9 months, but you understand fundamentally why its purchasing power will go up over time and why 8 billion people in the world need it, and what that equates to is the purchasing power of my money is going to increase over time rather than decrease. Every economic decision is altered in a positive way from that fact. And as you were talking about, Danny, that understanding of Bitcoin, one of the way that I try to conceptualize it for people is there's no way to understand it otherwise. It's kind of common as you got to read, you got to understand, you got to question what is money. That's proof of work. You got to experience Bitcoin on a direct basis. I think that sending a Bitcoin transaction and starting to see like, I just sent that and everybody else in the world is doing this. All the money's getting in the same place and there's no one in control of this thing. Like that's a kind of mind-opening experience in itself.
Well, that's why at the meetup, I was like, anyone comes along, I'm going to give you £5 of Bitcoin. Just come along. I want you to see this. And for each person, we would do the transaction on the Lightning Network. We would do the send. They would receive the Bitcoin. And I would sit there and explain to them and say, that has happened without any centralized database that somebody's in control of.
Right.
No one's done anything. I would say, if I send a transaction from bank to bank, it's a ledger update in here, ledger update in here, but they can fuck with this. You now have that. No one can take that from you.
Right. So here there is this system that I might not understand, but thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not millions of people are sending transactions originating from all over the world, going to different parts of the world. All the money is getting to the right places, only being able to spend by the people who it's supposed to be able to be spent by, and no one's in control of this orchestration. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Right? And then when if I say all value in Bitcoin is derived from the fact that there will only be 21 million, I say that repeatedly to like drive it in to somebody so that like when somebody walks away from this podcast, they're going to be like, he said that, like count the times that he said that. He said that like 75 times.
Right. Next time we do a podcast, we're going to have
a counter on the screen.
Yeah. Have a drink. And you have to have a drink every time Parker says all the value is derived from 20.
We'll never
like
get through the
clicker.
episode.
No, we'll have a drink. We'll have a whiskey.
Yeah,
we'll see if you could say it by the end of it.
Yeah.
You'll be like, oh, the value is derived from 26 minutes.
Right. But when somebody starts to understand the asymmetry of that, say they do not understand anything about Bitcoin. They just hear it. That is why Bitcoin is of fundamental value. And it can exist at the same time when people buy Bitcoin and don't understand that. People, yes, people speculate. Yes, very few people understand that fact. But if they key in on it and they're like, okay, if this is about, there's a form of money that can't be printed, and I know the governments are printing trillions of dollars, what would be the consequence if the entire world did adopt that? They key in on this is massively asymmetric, right? Like this knowledge, if the rest of the world's going to come behind me to adopt this as a form of money, Daniel, like you were talking, you go down that rabbit hole, and Michael Saylor's talked about this too. I would estimate, I mean, I've probably spent a lot more than this for sure, but you could spend 100 hours, and that seems like a lot, right? But if Bitcoin is this, even if there's a very small chance, which there's not, but even if when someone's hearing this for the first time, someone listening to this episode is thinking, okay, I with my limited knowledge might weight this outcome as very low. But even if there's a small percentage chance probability, if someone's telling me that I can invest 100 hours of my time, which seems like a lot, but it's not, to learn and understand the world's greatest secret, the most asymmetric thing that has ever existed, the adoption of a new form of money that will happen very rapidly, and very rapidly meaning like over years and decades, not centuries. If I wanted to become a neurosurgeon, it would take me 10 years. Or if I wanted to develop any skill of material value, it's going to take years, not 100 hours. So when someone is sitting there thinking like, fuck, you're telling me I have to do 100 hours of work? That sounds like a lot. That's the fiat world. But then when they start to think about it in this framework, like, hey, if I spend 100 hours, you're telling me that I'm going to be able to potentially grasp this entire thing and then use that asymmetric information to my benefit. Like, then it starts to be like, hey, even if it's a low probability, or I'm weighting it as a low probability going in, I have to do that work. I have to spend the 100 hours because there's nothing in the world that I could possibly benefit from an economic perspective in a similar way by devoting 100 hours to it. 100 hours of anything, being a golfer, a soccer player, a podcaster, like, you're not going to be a craftsman at whatever you do by devoting 100 hours. Devoting 100 hours to Bitcoin puts you in a massive asymmetric information advantage, or a position of that advantage over everybody else in the world. And that's why I reinforce it. It's like, it is about knowledge. It is accessible. I think a lot of the people that I've met that haven't gone down that path, there's this defense mechanism that says, if I go down that path, if I spend that 100 hours, I don't think I'm going to be able to understand it. And then they shut down and decide not to. And what I encourage people is like, this is the most asymmetric use of your time. If you have heard a few people that you don't necessarily think are crazy that are telling you to do this, go do it. You will, even if you come out with a conclusion that, no, I don't think there's there, it was still worth the investment. If you start to understand opportunity cost, asymmetry, and, kind of probability weighting. And what will happen if you do spend 100 hours reading books, podcasts, you will come out on the other side as someone who adopts Bitcoin, or at least buys it for the first time. It will harden your understanding. And then from there, from that point of buying Bitcoin for the first time, or realistically going down the rabbit hole for the first time, then you start to really experience Bitcoin. You start to notice things happening in the world that don't add up. You start to see how the things that Bitcoiners have been saying for a while are actually solved by this thing, Bitcoin. And you're able to allocate more toward it, because the more you understand Bitcoin, the more you understand its volatility. You understand that it's just phases of adoption and ebbs and flows, but you have to be in that position when the tide goes out on the old economy to being holding a form of money that other people will accept. And the reason why they will do that is because everyone will opt for a form of money that can't be printed. And it really is as simple as that.
Yeah, I'm going to finish on a little anecdote that you might find kind of interesting. So we get a lot of emails in from people listening to the show. One of the most interesting trends I've seen over the last year is the amount of people writing to me and saying, do you have a job? Can we work on the show? Or do you know any companies are employing? Like, it's almost like this is one of the final steps of going down the rabbit hole. It's like, okay, I've discovered it. I've learned about it. I've bought it. I've held it. Now I want to work in it. And they're like, how do I get involved? And sometimes it may be a case of, okay, you can't get a job, but they'll go and start a podcast, or they'll start writing, or they'll start a blog, or they'll start a meetup. But that is a massive trend that I've seen over this last year. It's like just email after email of people asking me this. And I find that a particularly cool thing.
Yeah, I think that it's a perfect extension of, if you've done that proof of work, if you spent that time And I think like an hour is like the opening salvo, or sorry, 100 hours, probably an opening salvo. Once you get there, you're probably going to keep reading and learning about more shit. But that once that light bulb has been turned on of, I kind of like think about it as phases of, you go from a zero state where this is crazy and maybe I'm still going to buy a little Bitcoin because in case I'm wrong, at least I have something. You go from zero state, not being able to see anything, not being able to understand Bitcoin at any level, and thinking that all these other people are crazy, to something, some amount of work and connecting that with some experience or some thought process that you have, you turn on and says, maybe there's something here. Maybe these people aren't all crazy. And then once you get to that point of maybe, your path to inevitability to being a Bitcoiner, to seeing it as money, to understanding the mechanisms, why it holds together, why it is a fundamental value, like to me is inevitable. Once something clicks in your head that says maybe, where again it's something that triggers that, and then you have to consistently get back there on a rational, logical basis. Then your interest fundamentally changes. You're like, okay, if the world is going to adopt this thing, Bitcoin, as its new form of money, and not in a niche way, but in an entire way, you're like, not only will my day-to-day be better if I'm actually working on that thing because it is fascinating, but I'm going to be getting in front of the largest tidal wave that's ever existed. And so there's some economic incentive, but then there's, a non-economic incentive, what we talked about before, getting to work day by day, side by side with Bitcoiners. That is more enjoyable than sitting at your fiat job, hating your life.
Yeah.
It is. Now, what I do also, not necessarily caution, but what I do recommend to people is working on Bitcoin or contributing to Bitcoin is not simply like writing, or not simply, but it's not confined to having a Bitcoin podcast or writing about Bitcoin or building a company like Unchained. Texas Slim and the Beef Initiative, Cole Bolton, they've incorporated Bitcoin into their businesses, and kind of they're working on decentralizing and localizing market access to food, and recognize, and it's one great example of like how you think differently. Like when these guys figured out Bitcoin, it was decentralized. They knew that there was a problem with the centralization of the food supply in the United States. They were like, hey, the group of people that's going to respect and value this are Bitcoiners.
Yeah.
Let's go talk to them. But functionally, the only part of their business that is Bitcoin is accepting it as a form of payment, right? And so you can incorporate your business or Bitcoin into your business without having to go, quote, work on Bitcoin. And there will be similar benefits to your network, your business, people. One of the things that I've experienced in many different places is that Bitcoiners will change their behavior. We're going to go eat dinner tonight at a steakhouse, and we were talking about going to Steakhouse A, Steakhouse B, and I was like, Steakhouse A has a Bitcoiner running it.
Yeah.
We're going to Steakhouse A.